World War II, Part 3, The Home Front. The essential questions we continue to explore in our World War II unit are: how did the unresolved issues of World War I pave the road to World War II? How did the U.S. contribute to the Allied victory in World War II? Specifically for Part 3, The Home Front, your objectives will be: describe the economic effects of World War II on the home front, such as the end of the Great Depression, rationing, and increased opportunity for women and minority employment. Analyze the function of the U.S. Office of War of Information. Explain the home front and how American patriotism inspired exceptional actions by citizens, including high levels of volunteerism, the purchase of war bonds, victory gardens, and opportunities and obstacles for women and ethnic minorities. Evaluate the domestic and international leadership of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman during World War II, including the United States' relationship with its allies and domestic industry's rapid mobilization for the war effort. Analyze the major issues and events of World War II, including the internment of German, Italian, and Japanese Americans in Executive Order 9066. Explain constitutional issues raised by federal government policy changes during World War II. So let's take a look at what was happening at home during World War II. To pay for the war, the federal government sold war bonds. The bonds gave monetary income and moral support to the government. Bonds brought in $185 billion to the federal treasury. The successful sale of war bonds also illustrated the high level of volunteerism during the war, the willingness of millions of Americans to help in the war effort. During the spring of 1942, the government began a rationing program for food and other goods so that it had a sufficient supply for armed forces overseas. Ration cards had to be used to purchase such precious items as gasoline, coffee, meat, and sugar. Rationing helped to regulate the amount of goods a consumer could obtain and was introduced to avoid public anger over shortages and to share in the sacrifices of war. Some factories converted from peacetime to wartime production. Many Americans planted victory gardens to grow their own fruits and vegetables. These vegetable gardens helped to make sure that an adequate food supply was available to both troops and civilians. By growing their own food, more of the food raised by farmers could be sent to American soldiers overseas. Take a look at some of these propaganda posters produced by the Office of War Information. In 1942, the President created the Office of War Information, or OWI. Among its wide-ranging responsibilities was the production of pro-Allied, anti-Axis propaganda, such as movies and posters, to make citizens aware of how they could help in the war effort. The Office of War Information controlled radio broadcasts, made posters and newsreels, and tried to promote unrest in Germany, Italy, and Japan in order to lower the morale of the enemy troops and to encourage their surrender. Until the last months of World War II, most Americans were unaware that the Nazis had embarked on a campaign to exterminate European Jews. On the other hand, the Nazi-forced labor policy, under which laborers from occupied countries were brought to Germany to work on farms and in war industries, was well publicized. By the end of the war, 1 out of every 5 workers in Germany was a foreigner. Workers from Poland and the Soviet Union received much harsher treatment than those from Western Europe. This poster reproduced here was intended to inspire the war effort in the United States and to bolster the morale of U.S. workers. Ben Shahn, a Jewish artist who was born in Lithuania, painted the poster for the U.S. Office of War Information. There were some major changes taking place back home in the employment industry. Women and minorities filled in the workforce for men overseas. By 1941, the strong wartime economy had resulted in labor shortages in some industries. Women began to enter the workforce in ever-increasing numbers. Women comprised about 46% of the workforce by 1945. A longer workday was reestablished to boost industrial output. Women worked as journalists, factory workers, drivers, farmers, mail delivery people, garbage collectors, builders, and mechanics. Some women enlisted in the WACs, or Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. During the war, women in the WACs served as nurses and radio operators. Taking the place of men in non-combatant positions freed men to go to the front lines of the war. By creating employment for women and taking women out of the home, World War II forever changed the traditional roles of women in America. During this time, the government also instituted the GI Bill of Rights, which made it possible for veterans to attend college for free after they returned from the war. Another group experiencing change on the home front were minorities. Large numbers of men enlisted in the armed forces and others were drafted. African Americans were restricted to segregated units and kept from combat until later in the war. African Americans had to battle on two fronts, the enemy overseas and the prejudice at home. The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African American pilots who served as bomber escorts. Even before the United States entered the war, civil rights activists anticipating involvement began to call for training opportunities for African American soldiers in all military roles and equal opportunities for African American civilians to work in war industries. President Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Committee that required defense contractors to hire blacks on an equal basis with whites. One civil rights leader of note was James Farmer. In 1942, James Farmer founded an interracial organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, to confront urban segregation in the North. That same year, CORE staged its first sit-in at a segregated Chicago restaurant. In 1943, a tidal wave of racial violence swept across the country, which revealed to many Americans, black and white alike, just how serious racial tensions had become in the United States. The struggle against Nazism abroad forced some Americans to reconsider the legitimacy of racism here at home in the United States. Mexican Americans also experienced prejudice during the war years. In the violent summer of 1943, Los Angeles exploded in anti-Mexican Zoot Suit riots. The Zoot Suit was a style of dress adopted by Mexican American youths as a symbol of their rebellion against tradition. It consisted of a long jacket and pleated pants. Broad-brimmed hats were often worn with the suits. The riots began when 11 sailors in Los Angeles reported that they had been attacked by Zoot Suit-wearing Mexican Americans. This charge triggered 2 nights of violence involving thousands of servicemen and civilians. Mobs poured into Mexican neighborhoods and grabbed any Zoot Suiters they could find. The attackers ripped off their victims' clothes and beat them senseless. The riots lasted more than 10 days and resulted in the beatings of hundreds of Mexican American youths and other minorities. Turning our focus to the internment of Japanese Americans and the Executive Order 9066. In February 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. The order was an offshoot of a combination of wartime panic and the belief on the part of some that anyone of Japanese ancestry was somehow capable of disloyalty and treachery. The order permitted military commanders to require Japanese Americans to relocate to interior internment camps away from western and coastal regions. As a result of Executive Order 9066, nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly moved to internment or relocation camps, where they lived in primitive and crowded conditions. Roosevelt justified the measures as a military necessity. Roosevelt's decision to remove people of Japanese ancestry to internment camps was a response to strong anti-Japanese sentiment. Korematsu was a Japanese American convicted of continuing to remain in a restricted area. Korematsu felt his constitutional rights had been violated. The Supreme Court heard the case, Korematsu v. U.S., but they upheld Roosevelt's order on the grounds that constitutional liberties may be limited in wartime. 50 years later, Congress apologized to the interned Japanese Americans and voted to pay compensation to the families involved. During the war, a small number of German and Italian resident aliens were also interned. About 2,000 German alien residents were forcibly sent back to Germany, and Germans were also sent from Latin America to the United States to be used in prisoner exchanges with Germany. By the end of the war, the American home front was profoundly different. Many deeds, both good and bad, had been performed in the name of patriotism. People of different cultures, backgrounds, ages, and especially genders had experienced massive changes in their lives.